As the war rages on and the Ukrainian army performs well in the battlefield, especially in the north, there is a renewed hope that Ukraine might be able to prevail over Russia. Prime Minister of UK Boris Johnson and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken both have said that they believe a Ukrainian victory is possible. It is worth noting that reclaiming Crimea might not be possible. Therefore, for Russia to lose face, it has to lose all the territories gained during the current invasion. While the Russian invasion has definitely gone astray, the outcome of the war is not going to be determined by the 3 months we have seen so far. The actual outcome will be determined by the test of resolve of each party, especially that of Vladimir Putin, as he cannot afford to lose the war, not just from a current political scenario, but also from historical and geopolitical standpoint. For this to understand, we must look into the history of modern-day Russia, particularly the two most important turning points in Russian history. The first is the fall of the Russian Empire and the second is dissolution of Soviet Union. In these two events, Russia not just changed geographically but also politically and socially, and it is still reeling from its effects to this very day. A private online poll was conducted in 2008 where Russia voted the most important figure from their history. Surprisingly, Joseph Stalin received 440,000 votes to Tsar Nicholas 430,000 votes. The only pro-democracy figure to make to the top 12 was Boris Yeltsin with a meager 100,000 votes. Another public online poll was conducted in 2018 showed that 57% of the Russians have a favorable opinion of Joseph Stalin. This shows that many Russians still reminisce about their lost glory days from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union and how the mighty have fallen. Whenever an empire falls, it is not because of one reason, but there are always a myriad of issues. Like the primary cause of the Russian Revolution were peasants' and workers' dissatisfaction with the Tsarist regime. But arguably, the biggest catalyst for the fall of the Russian Empire and the 300-year-long Romanov dynasty was the failure of the Russian army to perform in the battlefield, first in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 that led to the lesser-known First Revolution. Tsar Nicholas, however, survived the First Revolution, but its events paved the way for a much bloodier revolution of 1917. Russia entered the World War I with patriotic enthusiasm, with the defense of the Russian fellow Orthodox Slavs, the Serbs, as the main battle cry. However, by the middle of the 1915, the impact of the war was demoralizing. As the Russian forces suffered major defeats at the hands of the Germans, the local discontent grew further, and Tsar abdicated the throne. The Bolsheviks came into power later that year and signed a treaty with Central Powers. As a result of the treaty, Russia lost nearly all of Ukraine, the 3 Baltic republics, and some parts of the South Caucasus. The Grand Duchy of Finland also declared its independence. Following the treaty, the whole Romanov family was executed by the Bolsheviks. Therefore, the defeat in the World War I served as a major catalyst, not just for the fall of the Russian Empire, but the ultimate murder of the Romanov family. As the case with the Russian Revolution, the dissolution of Soviet Union was also because of the myriad of problems that were festering for years. Soviet Union was struggling with internal stagnation and ethnic separatism. However, the dismal performance of the Soviet army in Afghanistan contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union. It undermined the image of the Red Army as invincible, and it emboldened the republics to doubt the Red Army's ability to put down anti-Soviet resistance like it did in the past. After Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, in just 2 years' time, Soviet Union was dissolved and Gorbachev resigned from active politics. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia lost 23% of its territory and 48% of its population and went into deep recession, which continued till Putin came into power. Therefore, we can witness that Russia in its recent history has suffered major setbacks. They are largely brought by internal struggles and a decaying system that was greatly accelerated by losing key battles by its armies. Moreover, as per a study, 7% autocratic leaders get killed and 12% are jailed after losing office, compared to only 1% killed and 3% jailed when it comes to democratic leaders. All of this is known to Kremlin, and therefore Vladimir Putin has to deliver a victory in Ukraine, or else the consequences for Russian elite as a whole and Vladimir Putin specifically can be catastrophic. So far, the Russian state has not shown the sign of internal struggle, and the security apparatus has largely remained intact. But with the prolonged sanction and a weaker army, no one can predict how the future would look like, especially in the areas which have a troublesome past, like Chechen republics which host a large paramilitary reserves under Ramzan Kadyrov. Another important factor for Russia is to find a way to lift all the sanctions. Pressurizing continental Europe to end its sanctions as part of the ceasefire deal is what Russia could hope to achieve. According to a report, Russian central bank reserves hold $630 billion of foreign reserves before the start of the war. The biggest share of reserves was held in Russia itself in the form of gold, making up to 21.7% of the reserves. This is followed by China at 13.8%. However, since most of the US and its allies have frozen Russian central bank reserves, Russia now have access to only about half of its reserves. This is a massive loss, as Russia have to finance the war in Ukraine with the available funds and also have to pay the foreign currency loans from those available funds to avoid the risk of default, which Russia has been doing so far. Moreover, what makes matter alarming from Kremlin is that there has been a call from Western think tanks and most recently by EU Foreign Minister to seize Russian assets and use it as war reparations. Biden administration has already in the past earmarked half of Afghanistan's central reserves for the families of 9/11 survivors after Taliban government took control of Kabul. But Russia is no Afghanistan. The possibility of such a move is low, as Western powers have to present itself as a reliable partner for the rest of the world, and any such move, if taken, would be fought legally. A more pressing and immediate issue, however, for Russian leadership is the loss of the regional power status, something that Putin has been building for decades now. Russian presence is already threatened in the Nagorno-Karabakh, where Russia has stationed troops to keep the peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and recently Yerevan and Moscow accused Baku of violating the ceasefire in which 3 Armenian soldiers died. To ensure that a final settlement is on Russian terms, Russia can escalate further. Russia has the potential to mobilize its remaining standing armed forces of 1 million. It is worth mentioning that not all the 1 million active personnel can be mobilized and sent to Ukraine, as Russia has to keep its military inside the borders as well. Moreover, some of the armed forces like Navy are not relevant to the land-based war such as Ukraine. However, Russia can still double its invasion force in Ukraine, and there have been hints that Russia is already doing that, as reported by Pentagon recently. If the increased armed forces does not bring about the necessary result, Russia can start considering the use of the tactical nuclear weapons. Russia has a theory called escalate to de-escalate. This involves doing something so dramatic, so drastic, such as using of a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield so as to frighten the other side into backing down. The concern is that if Putin feels cornered and his strategy in Ukraine is failing, he could use the tactical nuclear weapon as a game changer to break the stalemate or avoid defeat. The most probable target for a tactical nuclear weapon is in western Ukraine to disrupt the supply routes coming from Poland. However, no one knows where the use of the tactical nuclear weapon would lead, as this would be uncharted waters for the world. This is a risk that Vladimir Putin is not willing to take right now, not as long as he thinks there is a realistic chance of winning through conventional means. As John F. Kennedy once said during the Cuban Missile Crisis, above all, nuclear powers must avoid confrontations that force an adversary to choose between a humiliating retreat and nuclear war. However, as long as both parties think that they can realistically win this war, peace will remain elusive. If you like this video, please like, subscribe and share, as this would help and motivate me to make more content. Thank you and have a good day.